about an hour for this segment of the program. We have a lot of questions. So if we get through all the questions within that hour and there's people who want to raise their hand and ask questions, we can do that if you want to. But if we don't have them all done within an hour, we'll kind of decide what to do at that point, but just kind of giving you a heads up what it'll look like. So we're going to ask a question, and then one or more of our, we'll call you providers, will answer the question. Question number 1 is, how do you get out of the flight or freeze response when feeling activated in a fear-inducing situation?
Well, if the fear is valid, you may not want to get out of the fight or flight or freeze. That is God's design for our bodies to respond effectively. Now, if the danger has fled or it's not actually dangerous, then there are many things you can do. I would say one of the top ones that we recommend is deep breathing. Deep breathing is a way to slow down your body. One way I like to think about it is think about all the ways that your body gets activated. So it starts to hyperventilate, your heart rate goes up, your temperature goes up, and basically do the opposite of all that. So you could bring your body down by slowing your breathing. You can bring your body down by cooling its temperature. You could bring it down by doing different mental kind of distraction tasks as well. I'm trying to think if we have a podcast episode on one of those. I think we do for DBT. I don't know if it's out yet, but there's going to be a lot ones also on the podcast that talks about coping skills. But a lot of it, just a way to summarize a lot of things you can do is your body is activated, and think about all the ways it's activated, and then you reverse it. Fast breathing, slow down your breathing. High temperature, lower your temperature. Your mind is racing, slow it down. And I think I saw a hand. I don't know if...
Was there a hand on that?
Yes, we call those grounding exercises. So if your brain and your body's kind of going to another place, you ground yourself in the present moment, yes. But there's a lot, I don't know if...
What you're referring to, I mean, I'm sure you have to understand that we probably use a certain version of some techniques, but there might be other ones too. We don't want to tell you what your doctor or your therapist told you is wrong. There's just a lot of different variations of grounding, but I know we've talked about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, where you look for 5 things that you can see and actually say them to yourself, 4 things that you can touch, different textures, your arm, your hair, the seat, that sort of thing. 3 things that you can hear. You have to slow down and not talk or hyperventilate to hear those things. 2 things that you can smell. Now, sometimes you can't always smell something, but for those of you that don't have a lot of smells around you, one thing I recommend is think of some smells that you can really imagine. I love the smell of grapefruit. I can imagine that right now and just get in the moment of smelling grapefruit. And then taste, maybe you can taste your breath enough to know you need to go brush your teeth, or that haystack is still stuck in there a little bit. But if you can't taste anything, think of the last thing that you ate and go through all the different parts of that meal that you can think of. And that should slow you down enough to be able to get out of that place too.
Now, there's one thing that we sometimes paradoxically will recommend as well, because there are some people who maybe aren't very practiced at the grounding techniques, etc., and they will try, but they say, well, when I try to do this, it makes it worse, and I have a panic attack. So some people, we will actually suggest if they're having a lot of difficulty to almost do the opposite, where we will encourage them to activate themselves more by like running. Sometimes Amanda tells people to run as fast as they can. And I've actually had one patient who told me like, yeah, she told me to do that. And then when I went to do it, I started laughing so hard because I was imagining myself running as fast as I could that I snapped out of my panic attack. And so, laughter in and of itself and humor can actually snap people, because it's virtually impossible to truly like laugh, especially like belly laugh, and be anxious, okay? So humor can be another thing. And then hydrotherapy, again, this is something that will actually increase your adrenaline rather than calming it, but it will spike it for an external reason, and then there's a calm that follows afterwards. And so there's all sorts of different techniques that can be used, and we encourage people to try different things out until they find things that work for them. But I do believe that ultimately one of the best ones is the deep breathing. Again, maybe at first that doesn't work too well, but people should keep practicing that and trying it, because it really helps very strongly from a physiological standpoint.
And just a quick comment on that. What people don't realize is you really want to practice these things before the fear comes and before the activation, because you build muscle memory that when you then actually, especially for deep breathing, start to do it in the moment, it kicks in quicker. And so I've had patients who are like, it doesn't work, and then they practice when they're calm, and then they're able to turn that on quickly when they need to.
Does everybody know what hydrotherapy is? Hot and cold, but you can also do it a lot briefer, because sometimes hot and cold requires a sauna or a hot tub, and then a cold bath. That can be really hard to do, but you can also do it in the shower, go back and forth between hot and cold, and you can even just do cold. You can put an ice pack on your face or get those frozen peas out of the freezer and just put it on your face, and that can change things pretty quickly too.
Awesome. This next one we could probably have a whole weekend on, but what influence have you seen on mental health and smartphones and devices? You might refer to a resource.
On smartphones, and mental health. So one of the interesting things I'll comment here is that we have clearly seen a rise in mental illness, not just since smartphones were around, but even before then, going back to World War II. But we've seen a sharp increase since smartphones came on the rise, especially in the adolescent population. In fact, there's some data where you can look at the graphs where it shows, especially in adolescent girls, the increase in depression and suicidality since 2012, and it was very sharp increase. And you see it tracking basically the same rate. And I'm not trying to blame, all of the increase in mental illness in adolescents on smartphones, but that is probably the biggest element. So it's not good in general for anyone's mental health to be stuck on a smartphone all the time, but especially adolescents are vulnerable because their brains are still developing and their frontal lobe is not fully developed, and they are very heavily influenced by peer pressures, their relationship and what other people think about them through social media and this sort of thing. But the research essentially shows that anything above an hour and a half of screen time, like entertainment screen time per day, is going to set up adults for more mental health problems, and anything more than an hour for adolescents or children will also set them up for an increase in mental health problems. And yeah, like Jared said, there's so much more to say. I'll stop there. We could have hours of presentation just on the effect of media.
It's also the number one way people look at pornography, through their smartphones. Even children, I think the average age a child was getting a smartphone was about 10 years old when they did they're still doing the NIH study, but then that correlated with the average age of a child first seeing pornography is at 11. And when I worked in the group home, most of the boys I worked with had seen porn on their cell phones, if not all of them.
And then just in addition to the actual screen, one effect that we don't really realize is the superficial connection, this delusion that we're connecting more, but actually not connecting. And so adolescents or adults, you see this especially after COVID, I can go to church on my phone, right, or on the screen, and it's really been the enemy's agenda of then really trying to replace the connection that then prevents us from developing mental health problems.
And on top of that, we've even talked how frustrating it can be speaking at different places, but we're not speaking there because we're doing it over the internet. And that's not to say we shouldn't do those things when that's the only opportunity, but they've done research recently to show that even certain certain parts of your brain don't light up when you do things over the computer versus in person.
I'll just make one other comment, which kind of goes along with the superficial aspect that Dr. Katie was talking about. Essentially, we're finding that people are lacking more and more empathy, that it's because we're communicating more with emojis and text messages and this sort of thing that it is taking away from our ability to read facial expressions and to have healthy interactions with each other and to even care about one another. And that's a huge problem, especially if kids are growing up. It's one thing for us adults who maybe didn't grow up with a lot of smartphone use and we already developed more of those empathy circuits. It's still not ideal, right? But imagine those kids that are so early on stuck on screens and they're having very little face-to-face interaction with their peers or adults. It's hard for them to develop empathy. And we see a lot of adolescents who are struggling with screen addiction that have a very flat affect. And they have a hard time even having normal facial expressions and having empathy for others because, and again, I'm not saying it's 100% from screens, but that's often a big part of it.
Alrighty. What do you think causes ADHD and how can we support ourselves or others with this?
I'll just say one thing. I'm sure they'll have things to add too. There are some theories that even trauma causes ADHD. It's a way of the body responding to trauma. And when you think about it, though, there are a lot of similarities in the symptomology where you have a hard time focusing. Well, sometimes people have a hard time focusing because they have hypervigilance. They're waiting for something to happen, something bad to happen because of trauma or a trauma experience. And so how hard is it to pay attention at school and to sit still when you're expecting something bad to happen? So that's just one theory out there. I think it's a valid one.
Yeah, so I think like with anything, whether it's depression or anxiety or any mental health disorder, it's generally multifactorial. And there's almost always some degree of a genetic predisposition. And then it can also be related to trauma. It can be related to screens. It can be related to poor nutrition. It can be related to toxins in our environment. It can be related to maybe not overt trauma, but some other maybe relational dynamics or conflict in the home. So there's a lot of different factors that can play a role. What we do know is that there's issues with the frontal lobe. That's the part of the brain that helps us focus. And oftentimes there's some hyperactivity in the limbic areas as well, in the emotional part of the brain. And so we know that basically anything that causes frontal lobe dysfunction will predispose people to concentration difficulties, and eventually it can turn into ADHD. And we also know then that anything that helps the frontal lobe to work better and also that balances the limbic system is going to improve symptoms of ADHD as well. But because of the levels of stress that we're facing and also the amount of bombardment with media, this is perpetuating this almost an ADHD society. What we're doing today, like having presentations that are 45, 50, mine I think was 60, minutes long. Most people can't handle that. So, your frontal lobes are actually working pretty well, I'd say. Nowadays it's like, a couple minutes and I'm bored. I want to pay attention to something else because we're just used to those quick breaks. And so, it's getting, worse and worse. And how do we support? Well, and by the way, some people even hypothesize that ADHD is, rather than being kind of a primary diagnosis, most often a secondary diagnosis. And that's kind of, I think, what Amanda was saying too. It's related to, other underlying issues like trauma, et cetera. So how do we support? Well, again, we need to identify how can I optimize my frontal lobe, and then also, of course, supporting people around us. Well, hopefully they're open and aware that it's an issue, because if so, then there are things that can be done. There's a lot of behavioral interventions that can actually be helpful, like, in other words, strategies to help with your organization and your regular structure and your daily schedule, ways that you can reduce the amount of distraction. And then there are supplements and medications that can be helpful too, especially for those cases that are pretty severe.
Alrighty. I'm going to reword this one. How do you deal with an abusive narcissist that is a close family member?
The simple answer would be boundaries, and I know Amanda is going to be talking about that tomorrow, so I don't know if I need to go into it because you have a whole presentation on it.
Yeah, and we've had conversations about this before too, all three of us, I know, but that word narcissism is thrown out a lot lately, so it almost becomes this all-encompassing anybody who's selfish, anybody who even sometimes can have high anxiety, and so they seem like they're trying to control everybody all the time, and it feels like they're being narcissistic. The best thing to do is spend limited, pre-planned time around that person if that's what you have to do. Sometimes we don't have any choice. I have to work with this person. It's not like I can quit my job. They're just there. So recognizing that I don't have to do an all or nothing thing. I don't have to either spend all of my time with them or none of my time. I can also be conscientious about the time that I'm spending with this person if they truly are narcissistic. But, that's a really general question because sometimes people might seem narcissistic, but they're really selfish because they're protecting themselves from something too. That's a really big question yeah.
Alrighty. A lot of talk is about the benefits of meditation. What can that practice look like for a Christian?
Often I do the form of therapy called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and I get this question a lot because from her perspective, the founder, Marsha Linehan, she talks about meditation and mindfulness, and I'll have a lot of Christians also ask about mindfulness. What's interesting is if you think about that term mindfulness, it says mindful, filling your mind, and a lot of false forms of meditation is emptying your mind. And so as we think about, okay, how do I perform healthy mindfulness? How am I filling my mind, and what am I filling it with? And so we want to be filling our minds with whatsoever things are true. That's the primary thing. And then the rest can be summarized with whatsoever things are helpful. So how do I fill my mind? And what I like about also meditation, biblical meditation, is being intentional about setting apart time And oftentimes we're very busy and our mind's very busy, but we can set aside intentional time to say, let me take one verse and let me be mindful of it. Let me be meditating and dwelling on this one verse. And then there's a quote in Spirit of Prophecy that she talks about, when you do this with Scripture, do it so much that what that promise has in that word then becomes your lived reality. And so for Christians, I think mindfulness is really important. It helps with concentration and focus, but it's really, what are you filling your mind with?
All right. After Dr. Cruz's talk about at 2 o'clock, does this mean any kind of mental health challenges are related to some kind of trauma?
So not always, and I think going back to Dr. Binus's response, that saying that many times there are many factors involved. What I was saying in my presentation is it's often related to trauma. And when you think about the reality of living in a sinful world, you can talk to most people and they have a lot of those experiences. And how do those experiences not shape us? So not saying that it's always due to trauma, but many times it is. And I would say probably even just in our clinical experience, we can see that. I don't know, many times I'll have clients say, oh, I didn't have a traumatic childhood, because they're thinking about those typical traumas, and then they continue to describe their childhoods. I'm like, yeah, you did. So not always, but I think often.
And it doesn't have to mean, too, that our parents or the people around us meant to traumatize us. Sometimes it's just the side effects of things that they've struggled with or they've been through that they don't realize have had an effect on us. So it's not about damning those people because of what they did. It's just recognizing, like, this isn't a healthy thing to grow up with. That doesn't mean God can't help us. It just means that we want to recognize things, and there are traumas that don't seem like traumas. I wasn't there for your presentation, so I don't know all the things that you talked about, but there are things like, watching parents fight all the time. I wasn't beaten up, but that can be traumatizing to see the two people that love you, that say they love you, and wondering, is my whole family going to fall apart? That doesn't seem like a trauma if it's just normal, but that can be traumatizing to a person, especially some of us who are more sensitive to those sorts of things.
Thank you. How can we support kids with mental health struggles?
Spend time with them. I mean, young people are predominantly exposed to peers their own age that don't often give the best advice or counsel. And there's a reason God gave every kid parents. So spend time with kids and listen. You don't have to do a lot of talking to get to the heart of a child. You can do a lot of listening and asking questions. And if you're really good at asking questions, I don't mean just repetitiously asking one question after the other, but really being thoughtful about your question asking, many times kids can come to the exact same thing you want to say to them on their own because you just asked the right questions.
Yeah, I think, you could do a whole parenting seminar, right? And the bottom line is there are certain things that you're going to have to be a little more careful of with a kid with mental illness, but for the most part, you're going to use the same principles as with a child that doesn't have mental illness, right? So you want to, yes, let them know that you're there with them, and not just in words, but actually in action. But then they also need firm limits. They need to know where their limits are, because sometimes we think, this kid has mental health problems, so we need to kind of let them let us know what they want or what they need, when in fact kids don't know what they really need. And that's where God has given us the role as parents and caregivers to actually, and I'm not saying we don't listen to their concerns, like Amanda said, that's important. We need to listen to their hearts. We need to hear what they think they need. But we listen to that, but then because we are in a place where our minds are more developed, we have more experience walking with the Lord and more experience in life, we need to make those ultimate decisions, like where those boundaries are. So we need to let them know where that is. That actually gives them the greater sense of security. And even if they fight it at first, in the long run, they're happier and they feel more secure. And then give them lots of affection. And even though there's limits, right? There's also lots of affection, lots of words and touch, like healthy touch and affirmation. So, we really talk about different parenting styles, right? We talk about the permissive parenting style. We talk about the authoritarian parenting style. Those are the unhealthy. Instead, we want the middle road, which is the authoritative. So, yes, we're warm, we're caring, but there's also limits and boundaries. And then, of course, there is a place for mental health help, but especially, for anybody, but especially young people are so impressionable. We have to be really careful if we're going to get mental health help. What kind of help is that? Is it truly help, or is it leading these kids down some strange direction that will open them up to, maybe more Eastern type thoughts, or just like hyper-focused on just medication to treat the symptoms. So there is a place for help, but we have to be careful what that source is.
And I'll just add that for kids, especially with mental illness, but just in general, giving them a sense of purpose. And I mean this even for little ones. If you ask them to help, if you ask them to get involved, oftentimes you see as they grow up, they might join a gang or they might go to a certain community. It's because they're looking for purpose. They're looking for purpose and community. So if you can provide that with small little tasks, chores in the home, or here at church. I know sometimes churches are, think that kids are a bother and they're loud and they're, and we sometimes put them to the side. Ellen White talks about that too. Like, no, we need to help the kids have a purpose so that they know that I am valuable.
This next one's related. How do you recognize that a child has been traumatized? What are symptoms, and what would be the best path to help them?
So one thing that they often emphasize is this kind of hypervigilance. Sometimes if you get near a child, it's kind of like that scared puppy that might bark or bite. So that often might be a sign of like physical abuse. And so being aware of like, how is this child around others? And if you're trying to show some connection, that might be a sign of hypervigilance, always on guard.
I think the biggest one is any drastic change in behavior. If you have like a sweet, kind of shy kid and they start acting a lot more agitated or hyperactive, that can be a sign. If you have a hyperactive kid hiding in the corner and doing things that they don't normally do and not wanting to be around anybody, sometimes that can be a sign too. So just watching a change in their baseline behavior is probably the best indication that something has happened.
And that could go beyond personality. That can be, does the child start bedwetting and they've had no history of bedwetting? I think it's a good summary of like any change. But that's obviously if you knew them before. It can be a little bit more difficult afterwards if you just met them as they are already experiencing trauma.
And also withdrawal certainly can happen as well. I mean, Katie mentioned the hypervigilance, which is true, but sometimes they can withdraw or become, one of the common signs for depression in young people is more irritability and agitation, like Amanda mentioned as well. So yeah, any of these changes could potentially be signs. Of course, looking for bruising on the body or sexual trauma. There's signs there that people could observe as well, especially if there's precocious sort of behavior, amongst like if suddenly they start like sexualizing their peers or something like that. That can be a sign sometimes. And how do you actually deal with that? Well, again, I think it's helping the child to be in an environment where they know that they are protected, that they're cared for. And a lot of times these kids, because they don't know how to deal with their emotions, they will, almost fight against that and disrupt the family dynamic or whatnot. But they need to have some limits, but also they need to, be reassured that they are loved and that they are cared for, and that you're going to keep loving them even if they're acting out. And then teaching them, how to recognize their emotions. And this is something sometimes even we as adults aren't the greatest at, but being able to, so you can actually have like one of those emotional charts and teach the child like, okay, well, what are you feeling right now? Are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling lonely? Right? So you help them understand their emotions so they can start verbalizing and knowing what they're feeling, because then as a next step, you can help them to actually see what they can do with those emotions instead of just like reacting to them, right? So it's a process, but it starts with them feeling at least some degree of safety.
And I want to encourage us as adults. Sometimes we say, okay, what are the signs? But to reduce our busyness. So many times as adults, and I've seen this in parents, they don't see the signs, not because the signs are not there, they're actually quite obvious, but because of their busyness. Even a lot of times this happens within the church because of the busyness of parents in ministry. And so I highly encourage you as adults, of maybe you yourselves are parents or even grandparents or just connected with the kids in the community. How can I always be available? How can I be not so busy that I'm not available for the child to come to me or for me to see those signs in the first place?
I know a young lady who's both her mother is out of the life. She has been experiencing mild case of depression. How can I help her?
I don't know if I heard the first part totally, but how can I help somebody who's depressed?
Yes, it's a young lady whose mother's out of her life and had been experiencing depression.
Oh, so she doesn't have access to her mom?
It
Or?
sounds like that, yeah. No mom.
Pray for her. If you don't have access, I mean, if you can't do anything else, you can pray for somebody. That's a beautiful thing that we have as Christians.
I think it was helping a girl who can't reach her mom.
Correct.
Suffering depression from it.
Sounds like this is a person not connected to the family, knows the lady, and this lady's mom is out of the picture, and she's wondering how she can help.
Oh, so being like a mother figure to
Yeah.
the person.
That's
Oh,
what I
okay.
understand.
Okay, if that's,
Child is mildly depressed,
Because her mom's out of the picture.
oh, okay. It really helps to listen and understand before you answer something, doesn't it? One of the best things for depression and also social time too is go on walks with her. I mean, that's a great way to get out of your depression, is to walk. And you don't have to say, oh, you're depressed, you need to go on a walk because it'll make you feel better. You can say, hey, I'd really like to spend some time with you. You want to go on a walk with me? And you can walk a lot of depression out that way. So that's one way. And then you can focus on scripture, memorize scripture like Katie was talking about earlier together and encourage each other with that. Pray together. Just be a godly person to that person. And you don't even have to say it's about depression.
It may be helpful for her, I don't know if she has gone through the grief process, because part of grief is accepting. So sometimes we haven't even fully grieved. We know the fact of that person's no longer in my life, but have I fully accepted and grieved so that I can move forward and connect with others? I'd encourage whether having her go to therapy to go through that experience or being a listening ear, as Amanda was saying, so that they can fully accept, grieve, and move forward.
All righty. Next one is, how do I overcome anxiety?
Go to Overcoming Anxiety and Depression online program, October 29.
Ready? Could my mental health challenges come from generational trauma if I can't remember any trauma of my own?
Could you read that one again?
Yep. Could my mental health challenges come from generational trauma if I can't remember any trauma of my own?
I mean, that's actually an interesting question because we do know that trauma does literally change genetic structure, and especially epigenetics, the expression of certain genes, and then in turn, those genes in a changed way can actually be inherited. So, in a way, yes, it is possible, but it doesn't always mean 100% because, someone in my past family tree was traumatized that I'm going to, have anxiety, but we could potentially have a higher predisposition. There's almost always some sort of issues that have taken place in our own life that are contributing to our own mental health problems. And it's not always trauma. There's a lot of other factors that play a role, including nutritional issues, lack of regular exercise, frontal lobe suppressing activities, like too much media, for example, any addictions, medical comorbidities, relationship problems, or other stressors in our life, and the list goes on. So there's a lot of other factors. Just because we can't remember a trauma doesn't mean that we don't have other reasons in our life that we could be struggling with some mental health issues. But it is true, again, that genes can change with trauma, and those can be inherited.
Another thing, too, that is not necessarily related to trauma is guilt. Guilt can also cause depression if it's not dealt with. And so, for instance, if I've done something in my life that I either haven't repented of, or I haven't tried to make amends for it, or I know I should be doing something that I'm not doing, or not doing something that I'm doing, that can lead to depression too.
There's a book called It Didn't Start With You. It talks about the generational impact of trauma. And so without a doubt, that definitely does have an impact. And then I would respond further with what Dr. Binus was saying. But I would just say a lot of times people over-identify with trauma, including generational trauma. Oh, my father, my great-grandfather, and so forth. And so they condemn themselves to never overcoming their mental health problems because of that generational trauma. And as we know God to be a God of choice, there could never be one factor that condemns us that we never could overcome on our own. So yes, definitely plays a part, but I just encourage people not to over-identify with that and to say, God, what is in my control? What can I do to overcome my mental health problems?
Alrighty. How do you live alongside people who will never be sorry for what they have done to you?
Why do you need them to be sorry for what they did to you is an important question. Sometimes we're waiting to get better because that person hasn't said I'm sorry, and maybe that person's not in a healthy place to be able to say that. Maybe they haven't worked through their stuff. The Holy Spirit hasn't done all of its work on them. And I know it sounds kind of a brutal question because we all want to think, oh, somebody should feel sorry and they should apologize to me. But I don't have to wait for somebody to be sorry to continue to move on with my life. And we don't have, I'm treading on, I don't know who this person is, but we don't have to continue to stay in that person's life either if they can't admit that they're wrong and they continue to hurt me or treat me poorly. I don't have to do that. There's nowhere that says I have to stay in this person's life. But I find so often the reason we stay is because we're waiting for them. They should say they're sorry, and I'm not going to move on until they say they're sorry. But we don't have to stay and wait for that. And we don't have to wait for them to say, I'm sorry, to get better ourselves or to move on in life and be productive ourselves.
Yeah, two words that come up for me are forgiveness and boundaries. So in order for us to be free emotionally of the bitterness and resentment that can easily become toxic for us, we need to forgive. But we often think that we can't forgive until somebody has actually apologized, but that is not what God has asked us to do. And it leaves us in a horrible conundrum, which is what Amanda was really talking about. Essentially, we're waiting for them, which is completely out of our control, what they choose to do, for us to be okay. So we can forgive, but that doesn't condone what they did. That's recognizing, hey, they really hurt me, they did something wrong, but I'm choosing to still let go of the desire to see them suffer, the desire to get revenge on them, and I'm letting go of that bitterness, that resentment, and oftentimes we don't have that in and of ourselves, right? So that's where we have to pray and say, God, I don't have the ability within me to forgive, but I want to allow you to do that in and through me. And Jesus is our example in all things, right? And even when he was being crucified to the cross, what did he say? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, Jesus, he was our example. I think he was showing as part of that we might not have the strength and ability, but we can say, Father, you do in me and through me what I cannot do myself. Maybe I don't have the strength to forgive them, but I'm choosing to allow you to do that in and through me. And that is something that we often need to repeat again and again, because I might forgive one day and maybe even the next hour that bitterness might come back up, but we can do it again. And I've had this in my life, and over time it works. God really does disentangle us from that bitterness and that anger, but it often takes weeks, months. But again, like Amanda was saying, if we're continuing to be like re-traumatized, we have to have those boundaries too. Forgiveness is given, but trust is what? Earned, right? So that we don't let that person back into that emotional, personal space if they've hurt us that way. We keep them at a safe distance. Now, if they're in our life day in, day out, and they're continuing to cause trauma, we're going to have to take some steps to get greater distance in one way or another. And so, of course, the principle is there. We're not saying exactly do this or do that. I'm not saying, okay, well, obviously, if you're married, you just need a divorce. No. That's not the point. But the point is there needs to be some boundaries that are set so that the trauma doesn't continue.
Alrighty. I had a hard time with the handwriting in this one. I want to try. If there is this strong correlation between trauma and other mental illnesses, is there an intentional effort for psychologists in your practice or in general to explore trauma and incorporate it as they consider diagnosing?
Yes.
And incorporate it as they consider diagnosing.
Yes.
All right. Yes. How do I find a safe, effective counseling service?
So a lot of times we think about finding a provider like dating. Many times we just go to the provider like, this is my provider. But you may not marry the first person you meet. You don't have to marry the first counselor you meet. So some people are like, how do I find the safe person? But they don't actually want to keep looking. They just want to how do I find it online? Who can you tell me? Well, the same way that you hopefully interviewed your future partner because that's an important relationship, it is an important, very important relationship with a therapist and counselor. So what I tell people is pray a ton. This person is going to be used by God for your healing. It's a sacred space. So pray, 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 pray. And then as you start to seek out, whether it's online, you type in what are local resources or word of mouth. But when you then go, interview them. Ask them what their expertise is. Ask them about their life. You can even assert what you want in therapy. A lot of times people don't know that. You can say, by the way, this is what I'm looking for. I really want a lot of skills, or I want this, or whatever it may be. And then you continue to pray, because that person may be helpful for a season. It may not be for the entire thing. I've known clinicians who are under the umbrella of Christian or Adventist that are not necessarily safe. And so don't go into it saying this person has a label. You need to do the work of prayer and investigation.
I'll just give an example. So when I was in school, I had to go to therapy. That was part of the education of training me to be a therapist, is to learn, well, what does it feel like to be on the other side? I had never been to any formal therapy before being in school to be a therapist. And the first person I went to was the most highly qualified, had years and years and years under his belt. And in fact, I had heard at least half of my classmates, because we all had to do this, went to the same person. And they were like, oh, this person's great and everything. And mind you, we didn't all have the same religious background. And so I thought, okay, I guess I'll go to this person. And I sat in there and I realized, this doesn't feel comfortable to me. There's something that just doesn't feel right. And I didn't know to even ask questions. I thought, okay, I'm just going to, meet the requirements. And this person wanted to hear something that I wanted to talk about. So I came up with something to talk about. And I realized that, I'm not sure if I like where this person is taking me. And so I asked this person, I said, can you tell me a little bit about your religious background and, things that are important to you, like your worldview and values and so, because I wasn't sure I was getting what I was hoping to get. And this person said, yeah, I can do that. It was about the end of the session. And the next session I came to, this person gave me an 80-page thesis that they had written on, I think it was Sabbath school or something. I don't remember. And I remember getting it and going, I think I just figured out why I don't feel comfortable here. And I wasn't able to spend a lot of time reading through the thesis because I was in school at the time. But I went to somebody else who wasn't even licensed yet. They accidentally sent me to her. And I had a really good connection. I thought she was a spiritual person. I didn't get to stay with her because she wasn't licensed, so it didn't count. But I found somebody that I knew was a much better fit for me, and they weren't even the most qualified person. So it's okay to shop around. I use the analogy of like a hairdresser. One, if your hairdresser doesn't give you a good haircut, don't keep going back. And two, you don't want your hairdresser to keep you in, the past several decades when you should be moving forward too. So if your therapist isn't pushing you a little bit, we shouldn't be entirely comfortable in therapy. That doesn't mean a bad discomfort. Sometimes it's, oh, yeah, I know I need to be doing this. It's okay to have somebody push you a little bit and get you out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, you don't want a 1980s haircut.
Actually, that might be in now again.
This next one might be covered tomorrow, but how do you set boundaries with toxic family members?
Oh, is this person going to be there tomorrow? I don't want to give away all the stuff I'm going to talk about. I'm going to make you want more. Come tomorrow and hear the answer. That was a boundary, by the way.
A friend shared that they are struggling with addiction. How do I or do I not help them?
I love these questions.
So a friend is struggling with addiction?
Yes.
How to get help them? Okay.
How to help a friend with addiction.
Well, one thing I would say is make sure you realize that it's not your job to fix them. That's very key, because sometimes, and that's true with any mental illness, it's not our job to fix the person struggling. And I like a lot of the things that Al-Anon does. I'm not saying it's a perfect, organization, but one of the big things I really like about it is saying, look, I am helpless to truly fix this person and to I wouldn't say help, because you can help them, but it's not your job to fix their problem. But it's turning that issue over to God, right? That's part of the 12 steps. So I think really praying for this person, praying for yourself, that you know what to say, what to not say, and then having healthy boundaries with that person, not enabling them, not saying it's fine what you're doing, really being careful with your boundaries with them. But then also, like I talked in my talk, it's so important. Truly healthy relational connection is key and can help significantly when it comes to overcoming addiction. But that's part of a healthy relationship, right? Is boundaries. And so a lot of these individuals that are struggling with addiction have not seen or experienced what healthy relationships can be like. And so if you can model that instead of repeating maybe unhealthy relationship patterns with them, getting sucked into that can be part of what can actually truly help them.
I do want to say something about Al-Anon, that Al-Anon is really good in that it helps you understand what healthy boundaries are, because sometimes we have people in our lives and we think we're helping them, but you go to a program like Al-Anon, and I don't mean to advertise profusely for them, but if you go to a support group for people who have a relationship with somebody who's an addict, you might learn that the things that you think are helpful are not actually helpful. And usually one of those groups will have multiple people in it of varying levels of awareness of how to deal with addiction. So somebody might be there who's been there for 20 years because they've had an alcoholic spouse or something, and you might just be like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And as you hear them talk, you start to realize, oh, that helps them. I thought that was a mean thing to do with this person, but they're showing me that no, that makes a lot of sense. I do want to do that, or I don't want to do what I'm doing. So I think that's the important thing of a group like that to be a part of, because oftentimes we think we're doing something that's helpful, but we're not. Also, recognize too, how much is that person willing to get help? I don't want to be doing all the work for them, calling up people, trying to schedule them, but they don't want help yet. So the first thing is to pray for that person, that the Holy Spirit would convict them that they truly do have a problem, that they need help.
All righty, last one. I've been hurt by so many people in my life. How can I learn to trust anyone?
There's a great book, I'll recommend it tomorrow on my slides, but it's by the same authors as Boundaries, the book, by Drs. Henry Cloud and I think Townsend, called Safe People. And so that's a good resource to read, because a lot of times, because you've been hurt so much, you don't even know how to identify safe people. So I know that when I'm working with my clients that are healing their trauma and they're like, okay, I'm ready to start trusting again, they don't know how to trust. So that's one thing, just reading the book, that's going to be very helpful. And then there's this thing that we use called the trust star. And you can imagine a star with different prongs. And it's basically understanding that you can trust some people, sometimes with some things. We often paint trust as black and white. So when breaks our trust in one area, I can't trust them at all. Or then the opposite to that is we want to open ourselves up completely. But if I can trust some people, sometimes with some things, I need to ask God for discernment. Oh, I can trust so-and-so with my car keys. They're a great driver, but I would never trust them with my secrets. I would trust them with, maybe my secrets, but I wouldn't trust, my friend holding something because they're very clumsy. So we have to really start having discernment to learn, what is this person teaching me? And then asking God to guide you in that process.
All right, well, that landed right almost exactly half hour. Do we want to call it good there? All righty. So what happens tomorrow? That's right, breakfast. We have at 9 o'clock our next meeting for tomorrow. We have 3 more sessions, and we have a brunch that's provided for you, and it's going to taste amazing. So you don't want to miss it. You don't want to miss the intellectual food, because that will be amazing as well. I don't know about you, but this has been some of my favorite mental health talks I've heard in a long time, and I've heard a lot of them. They've been very helpful for me, and I'd like to see if we could give them a round of applause to thank you for today.